Hi everyone, it's Megan, and I'm here with another video tutorial for a simple scrappy pattern. Today we're going to make a set of coasters from your string scraps, and they're super quick and easy. They make awesome gifts, and you can make them kind of in a rainbow of colors, kind of in an afternoon. So it's an awesome little project to get you started if you've never done Quilt as you go, or you have a need for a last minute gift. So let's get started. We're ready to make our coasters. This is all that you'll need to make a complete set of 6 coasters. You'll need scraps of batting. Now I've cut mine into 7-inch squares. I do that when I'm done with a quilting project. I take that little kind of the side pieces of batting and anything that's smaller than like a 20-inch square for a pillow front or a long rectangle for a table runner, and I cut it into 7-inch squares. So I'm ready to go to make a set of coasters whenever I want. You'll need fabric scraps. These are all of my pink string scraps. Now you can obviously mix and match colors or do it very scrappy, but you'll just need to make sure your scraps are a little bit longer than your batting piece. You'll need fabric for the back of your coasters. I'm using a fat quarter here with these little flower prints since I'm doing kind of a Valentine's Day inspired coaster set. Cutting this fabric will be our first step because you can get 6 7-inch squares out of it and also an extra little strip to add to your scrap pile. You'll need a rotary cutter and a ruler. You'll also need a good pair of scissors because we will be trimming these strips down right at our sewing machine. And you'll need matching thread because some of the lines of our bobbin thread as well as our top thread will be visible in the finished coaster. So that's all we need. I'm going to press this fat quarter and show you how to cut it up into 7-inch squares. I have my fat quarter pressed and ready to cut, and to use this shorter ruler, all I've done is just fold my fat quarter in half, and these are the 18-inch sides. This is the 21-inch edge. I line it up on one line of my cutting mat and make sure that the edges are over one line, and I'll use that line to give myself a nice clean cut. And now we can count over 7 and make another cut. Now I make my coaster 7 inches square. I cut my fabric and batting 7 inches square. The actual coaster ends up being about 6.5 inches square. And I like a nice big coaster. I like my mug and my little kind of morning snack, all in one place. So if you would prefer a smaller coaster, you can certainly adjust these to whatever size you like. So these are our 2 7-inch by width of fat quarter slices. And we're left with this little piece left over. Now I'm just going to cut this down so that it's a little bit easier to use in our scrappy coaster tops. And I'll add these 2 strips to our pile of scraps. Now for these pieces, we are going to get 3 7-inch squares out of each one. So I'm going to open them up and align them this way. So I just line it up on a line, just as I did before, making sure that both edges are over any line on your mat. And make a squaring up cut. I always double check. I always count over because I've made that mistake a couple of times where I used the numbers and then I was off one. So I just double check and count. And that has saved me from wasting a lot of fabric. So now we have our 6 7-inch squares for the back of our coaster, along with a couple of extra little bonus strings to add to our collection. So now it's time to move over to the sewing machine and make our coasters. We're ready to make our coasters. I have my backing squares, my batting squares, my strips, and my scissors all close at hand. But I'm going to set these aside for a minute, the backing squares, because we won't need those until the last step of the coaster assembly. So what I need first is a batting square and some scrappy strips. Now, if you haven't ever done quilt as you go or improv piecing, it's a very kind of loose and non-stressful. Like, this should be a fun project, right? So quilt as you go is just like piecing, except we're also going to be sewing through the batting layer at the same time. So you take your first strip and align it with the edge of the square, overlapping it just a bit, because later we're going to trim this down. And we don't want any batting to overhang our coaster top. So we have the one piece ready to go. We're going to grab another scrappy strip. And these are all different widths, and it doesn't matter. They'll all blend together in the end. So we just trim that down to size, and then we align the edges of the 2 strips. And we still want to make sure that the batting is being overhung by the fabric strips a little bit. And now we're going to sew 1/4 inch away from the edge of the fabric strips. Now I have changed out my thread to my matching red thread in the top and the bottom, and I'm using about a 2.5 inch stitch length. And you want to sew from off the batting to off the batting. And then we're just going to open this up and kind of finger press that crease. Now I like to take the extra step of just doing a little tack down stitch kind of right at the edge of this new strip to hold it in place while we add the next strip to it. So I just stitched for about an inch, 1.5 inches right at the edge of this fabric, about 1/8 inch in. And that just helps keep this strip from kind of flopping back over as we get our next strip ready to go. So now we just repeat this process all the way across. We grab a strip, line it up, and trim off any excess with our scissors. And now we're ready to sew another 1/4 inch seam. Okay, we're ready for our last strip, and we want to make sure that we choose one that's wide enough right here to hang over the edge of our square of batting. So like if we chose this one and then took 1/4 inch away in the seam allowance, we'd end up with a really skinny strip left over. So this last strip, you just kind of want to think about, make sure it's wide enough to really cover your batting. I'm going to use this really nice wide one. Right. Now it's kind of hard to tell where the batting is to do our little tack down stitch. So for this last one, I just flip it over and I tack right along the edge of the batting. Just like that. And now that we've done all of our piecing on the top, it's time to add a little bit of detail stitching on the top of our coaster. Now, this is a great place to use all those little decorative stitches on your stitching machine. I'm piecing on a Juki today, which only does a straight stitch. So I'm just going to do a little echo of each seam on either side of each of these seams. We have our coaster top that has been trimmed back down to 7 inches, and I just used the outline of the batting to do that. Trimmed off all the excess, and now we are ready to add the back of our coaster. And we're going to do that by placing it right sides together with our top. And we are going to stitch 1/4 inch away from the edge, leaving about a 2 to 3 inch gap along one side. And I have found it easiest to leave that gap along this edge that has the strip rather than this edge that has all the seams on it. It just makes it a little bit easier to press and top stitch at a later step. So I'm going to start right here, go all the way around, and back stitch at start and stop. We're ready to do the last few steps of our coaster, but first we need to trim the corners of our squares. Now this is going to be turned right side out, so there will be a lot of fabric here right on this inside corner if we don't trim it. So this will just help your coaster lay nice and flat and not have like a big bulbous corner. So I'm just trimming at like a 45-degree angle right outside this line of stitching here. You don't want to clip the stitching. Although if you do, just like here, I'll show you. If you do clip your stitching, whoops, all you're going to do is run another line of stitching parallel to the cut that you just made, as close to the edge as you can get. And just back stitch a couple times, and that'll help keep that corner from coming undone. So now it's time to turn it right side out. And you just want to make sure that you start with you want to get your fingers between the two right sides of fabric. You don't want to try to go between the batting and the fabric, or you'll have a lot of trouble since that's stitched down. So make sure you're between the top and the backing, and just take your time and wiggle it all through. You can use your fingers to kind of poke out the corners and the edges. And then I take a old knitting needle I have just to poke out the corners. And you just want to very gently nudge that into the corner and wiggle it around a little bit to get your corners nice and poked out and square. And I kind of run it along the seam to the next corner and do the same. You'd want to take your time and go kind of gently because there's not a lot of fabric here beyond your stitches. So it'd be really easy to poke right through your stitches. So just take your time, nudge it all out. If you don't have a knitting needle, you can use a bodkin like this. You could use a little bodkin, or you could use one of those purple things. Those are really handy to have around. You just don't want anything with a sharp point, like don't use your scissors. Now it's all nice and flat, and we're just going to quickly press this so that it's nice and square and the seams are completely out. Okay, we're at our pressing surface and our iron is nice and hot. I'm just going to take a moment and kind of fold in the 1/4 inch seam allowance from this opening and put a little clip right there just to hold it in place while we start to iron. So I'm just going to roll the seam allowances in my fingers to get them nice and flat, and then I'm going to take my iron and press. So I'm just using my iron to press, and I'm going to remove that clip and make sure I press that opening. And that's it. One final step. We are going to top stitch along the outside of the coaster. And you want to do this about 1/8 of an inch away from the edge of the coaster, so you're sure to catch the seam allowance from the opening. If we did a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, because there's only a 1/4 of an inch of fabric turned in, you might not catch it and this opening might pop open. So 1/8 of an inch all the way around. All right, we're ready for the top stitching, and you can start anywhere. I'm just gonna start right here. Now you might want to change your stitch length to around a 3. It'll make it a little bit easier to stitch over some of these bulky seams. Just take your time around the corners. I find it's easy to get pretty close to the corner and then kind of move this to a 45-degree angle and then kind of complete the curve around the corner to the next side. Now, if your machine does have a little bit of trouble getting through some of these areas, using a stiletto can really help. You can kind of push the seam allowance down and help feed your fabric through your foot. Also, this is pretty thick, so if you need to adjust the tension on your sewing machine foot, decreasing that tension will kind of raise this up and put a little bit less pressure on your work and make it go through a little more smoothly. I just take a few little back stitches there at the end just to lock this together, and then we just have a few little threads to clip. And there's our finished coaster. Isn't it adorable? Perfect. I'm ready to make the rest. So that's it. That's our little scrappy coaster. I made all of these in about an hour and a half. I will say that although they are made with scraps, they're not like an amazing scrap buster project, because I'm looking over at my pile of pink string scraps and it looks pretty much the same as it did. But they're super fast, and you could also apply this to a larger project like a table runner or maybe some placemats, and that would eat up your scraps a little bit faster than coasters. So if you liked this tutorial and you'd like to see more, I have a new video every Monday morning. So be sure to hit subscribe, and I will see you then. Happy quilting!